Hello. Thanks to LIFT for inviting me to kind of share some of the research that we've been doing in Nokia. I have been living in Tokyo for the last 7 years and working 6 of those years for the research laboratory. And I now work for the design studio in Tokyo, Nokia Design. And this presentation is kind of about some of the more exploratory research that we've been doing. Although I'm based in Tokyo, you might expect me to be talking about all the fantastic stuff that goes on there technology-wise. But actually, this is kind of where my heart is. And so I'm just going to share a bit of my research. So, a few years ago, some people approached me in the company and asked, what would it take to design a phone for illiterate people? So, and there were about 1 billion phones, mobile phones sold last year. So many of those phones are sold in emerging markets where there's a relatively high number of illiterate people. So what would it take to design a phone that's optimized for illiterate people? And that's what this presentation is about. So let's start with the definition. This is the UN definition of illiteracy and literacy. Which is a useful enough place to start. And we started with some assumptions. And so the first assumption that we made was that pretty much everyone can appreciate the ability to transcend space and time in a personal and convenient manner. So you might ask, well, what's that got to do with mobile phones? Well, actually, this is the core functionality of a mobile phone. You can transcend space by calling someone who's not in your co-proximity. You can transcend time by messaging with them, or even calling up and leaving a message on an answer machine, and that other person can pick up that communication at their own convenience. And you can do this in a manner that's both retains your privacy, the personal nature of that communication, and it's convenient. You don't need to ask anyone. You just can go ahead and do it. So actually, this, transcending space and time, is what this does. And yes, you can do things like that with phone kiosks and PCs, but the personal and convenient nature of that communication is what makes these stand out as well. So that's the first assumption. The second assumption is kind of designing this to support illiterate people is kind of like designing around the problem rather than attacking their problem, which is illiteracy, right? So, and I don't pretend that I can solve the issue of illiteracy worldwide, but as a design team, we need to recognize that. There's also a kind of devil's advocate, and the researcher in me kind of recognizes that literacy itself is in fact kind of a stage in human evolution, and there'll be a point in time, if we're still around and the planet still exists, where literacy will move on from kind of, textual literacy will move on from where we are now, and there may not be any need for textual literacy. Okay, what is the scale of the issue? How many illiterate people are there on the planet? The UN estimates there are almost 800 million illiterate people, by that definition, 270 million of which are in India. And it's worth pointing out that you can find illiteracy everywhere. I live in Tokyo, my Japanese is pretty poor, and I'm semi-literate when I'm in Tokyo. You know, I speak a couple of other languages, but in Japan, I'm semi-literate. The challenge is really that these devices are largely designed for markets like this. This is Helsinki in the winter, and it's snowing, if you couldn't tell. And increasingly, they're being used in markets like this, in markets like India, China, Brazil, Indonesia. And the thing about those markets is there's actually much less access to structured learning, the stuff that you can learn in school. There's much less access to formal schooling. And the way we think about the problem is in terms of structured and unstructured learning. So there's the stuff you learn in school, like learning how to read and write, learning how to use numbers and how to apply those numbers. And then there's the stuff that you learn in everyday life, like how things look, how they behave, how they feel, and how they sound. And yeah, you know, the designers in here, we know that you learn that stuff in school as well, but you know, most people on the planet, this is how it divides up. And the challenge is that these are largely designed based on kind of textual prompts. And that's a major barrier. Literacy itself, when people talk about literacy, what they're really talking about is textual literacy. They're not talking about, for example, computer literacy or numeracy, which is another important concept. And also the idea of proximate literacy. So proximate literacy is where I don't know how to use this, but Nicholas does, and actually it's just as easy for me to ask Nicholas if I can ask him to show me how to use this. If I have ready access to Nicholas, then why should I need to learn it myself? So the original design kind of challenge, really, what would it take to design a phone for illiterate people? When you ask most people this question, most people propose an iconic interface, which makes perfect sense, except that icons are just another language, essentially. Think of kanji scripts in China, that's a form of iconic interface. They can be very difficult to learn if you don't actually understand the text that goes with them, so as part of the learning process. And if you genuinely want to make these products suitable for the local markets, you actually have to design and test those icons across different markets. So it's part of the solution, but it's not actually the solution itself. And this is a reoccurring theme with all these little things that you can do with literacy and redesigning the device. There's no silver bullet, but there's lots of little things that you can do. So, design research is all really about asking smarter questions. And so, the smarter question for me would be, to what extent is textual literacy a barrier to actually using this? And in fact, should we even be talking about designing for illiterate people? Should we really be talking about to what extent is textual illiteracy a barrier to actually being able to use this competently? So what do I mean by competently? I mean being able to transcend time and space in a personal and convenient manner. You don't need to learn everything on this, but you just want to be able to use that functionality. So I'm fortunate enough that Nokia has the resources, that we can put together research teams and we can go and research, and we've been researching for 3-4 years in places like India, China, Nepal, Uganda, working with local collaboration partners. I specialize in kind of quite exploratory research, things like home visits, going into people's workplaces, following them around with cameras, with their permission, of course. And in this kind of ongoing research, we've really been looking at the range of things that illiterate people were able and unable to do in their everyday lives, and really looking at where textual prompts were barriers for them to be able to achieve what they wanted to achieve. So, for example, here in China, we're in someone's home and they might be talking about how they manage their contacts. And if we did this kind of interview in a research lab, which we have access to, the mirror glass and all this kind of thing, they might talk about their address book, but actually when we're in the home, we can go into the home space, they talk about their address book, they go to the drawer, you can see all the other stuff in there, and it's just such an incredibly rich environment to collect data. And to take that data and to take those experiences back to the designers in Nokia. So we've been thinking about all the other things that illiterate people can do. Can you turn the lights down a bit more, because these pictures are just not showing up well. You can't. Okay. That's a TV. So how do illiterate people watch TV? Turn on the TV, change the contrast, change the volume. They can do it, but to what extent can they do it? How do you tell the time if you're illiterate? How do you use mechanical objects? And how does the mechanical aspect of those objects aid in the understanding of the use? So we've been looking at this full range of things that people are doing, and then we would explore the mental models that they had of the things that they were using and trying to understand kind of the barriers to their understanding of these things. Illiterate people actually have textual objects in the home. So I mean objects that you would imagine text would be an integral part of that object. So a calendar. So calendars have these kind of numbers in a particular format, and even if you don't necessarily understand the numbering system, you can understand the relationship and perhaps understand how a calendar works. Here's a humdinger. So to contact someone, you need to have contact information, right? You need an email address, a phone number, postal address. If you can't read and write, how do you manage your contacts? And actually, millions of people do it every day, and how do they do it? And it might seem kind of basic as a company that sells products to these people and not really understanding how they're actually using it. How do you know whether you're being paid enough? How do you manage your accounts? When you go to the market, how do you know whether the goods that you've been sold is the correct amount? How do you know you've got the correct change? And again, millions of people do this every day, but how do they do it? And then exploring kind of around the edges of things. So, you know, all this stuff is not happening in isolation. People live in societies like here in Uganda where there's consistently power cuts. So how do you keep your device charged when you've got no access to electricity? Well, that's a simple example of the kind of services that spring up. And working for a large corporation, how do you conduct this research in a way that is kind of consistent to the values of that corporation and that sufficiently respects the cultural and ethical kind of aspects of the research? And especially given that we really, really do need and want to have access to the details of people's lives. We want to know what they carry. We want to know where they keep things in their home. We want to see their bathrooms. We want to know everything about it. And how do you do that and still retain that kind of sensitivity? And we have lots of processes that we've evolved to do this. Okay, what did we learn? How much time have we got? So what did we learn? Oh, yeah, that's me, right. Okay, the first thing is that illiterate people actually tend to work incredibly long hours. They tend to have the poorest jobs in society. So working 5 to 9, 7 days a week, you might get 2 days off in a year. So my question to you is, who needs to be able to transcend space and time more? Is it the banker in New York? Is it you? Or is it the farmer on the outskirts of New Delhi? Okay, I would say that these guys do, more than you and I do. The next thing is that illiterate people can actually do absolutely anything. It just takes a lot longer. Simple example, if I want to fill in a form, I can just do it here and now. An illiterate person, that might be a task that takes 24 hours. They take the form home, they ask a relative, can you help me fill this in, and then you bring it back a day later. So that kind of process, you give up a lot of privacy. And if you think about what you might want to communicate with one of these, you actually want to retain a lot of that privacy. So anything's possible, it's just not particularly practical. You can read. I'm a little bit dry, so. What can illiterate people do? So one of the things, or the kind of basic things that they can do on the phone is that they know how to keep it charged, they can turn it on, they can turn it off, they can answer calls, and they can make local calls. And the kind of the first barriers that kick in are things like when you need to make national calls, when you need to learn how to do things like doing prefixes, and we find that being a stumbling block for some people. Absolutely anything involving editing and managing is a problem for people, for illiterate people to manage on their own. Illiterate people tend to carry a physical address book, and that address book tends to have a lot of kind of scraps of paper in it because people hand over contact information and they just store it all in one place. And actually, if you want to make the use convenient, part of convenience is actually having information in a format that is convenient for you, and this is not exceptionally convenient. So the other thing is that actually in a lot of these environments and ecosystems, the learning experience is not as consistent as you or I might be used to. So the network coverage might be poor, you might be using a second-hand device, the battery might cut out frequently because it's extremely old, the keypad could be worn to the point where you can't see the numbers. So imagine trying to learn in an environment where things are that inconsistent. Okay, here's a thing on risks and consequences. And it's really about, to what extent, I mean, designers often say, well, okay, I'm going to design this stuff, and they'll discover these features. And to what extent are illiterate users willing to learn by trial and error? So this is my question to you. Collectively, you need to go to the toilet. Okay, you'll probably queue up, but what is this building? Could someone tell me what this building is? Don't be shy. Who's at that? Can you stick your hand up? A men's room. Okay. Does anyone disagree that this is a men's room? Okay, you're pretty confident. Okay, the variable meaning of the word toilet in different cultures. Good guess, but I'll just take this point for a moment. So you're saying it's a toilet. Okay, it seems to be. This is not a trick question, right? Thank you for volunteering. So my next question is, how sure are you? You're standing out there, you need to pee. How sure are you that this is a toilet? Okay, you would watch a while. Okay. My question to you is, what is the cost of making the wrong choice? What is the cost of walking in there and discovering it's not a toilet? Or what is the cost of not going in there at all? You don't need to answer that. Yeah. Okay. So you do need to answer this. Would you walk in there if the cost was minor personal shame? You walked in there and you discovered it's in fact a hairdresser's or the headquarters of a political party, and that's the candidate. So if you walked in there in that context, okay, if it was your community, you'd be careful. Where are you from, sir?
I'm not from there.
Okay, this is Bangalore. So, okay, next, would you actually walk in there, and if you got it wrong, it would cost you 1 month's wages? Okay, you wouldn't. No. Is anyone would walk in here if it would cost you 1 month's wages? Okay. And next, would you walk in here? Would anyone walk in here if the cost of walking in there and getting it wrong was the livelihood of your family for 1 month, for your entire family? Okay, and my point about this is, when you're designing something like this and you kind of might assume that people will explore, there's a cost to exploring, and people don't necessarily understand that cost, and it's either through poor mental models, but also they could change settings so things genuinely don't work and they don't necessarily know what's been changed. Imagine you could go to the address book and you didn't know whether a button was going to be to create a contact or to delete all your contacts. There's a cost there, right? And so we've been exploring this, and we've been also looking at kind of the different cultural attitudes to exploration and so on and so forth. So the thing that was missing from this is when you stood there, you saw people going in and out, you saw the ladies next door. As contacts, you could smell that pungent smell as well. And actually the challenge is, how do we provide that kind of context on here when people are exploring this? I think that the next thing is something that really surprised me and constantly surprises me when I'm working in places like Uganda and India. And it's really about the similarity between extremely rich people and illiterate people, who tend to be kind of the poorest in society. So extremely rich people can have assistants that they delegate things to. So I want to speak to Spielberg. All right, get him on the phone. You just get the phone and then you make the call. And actually, illiterate people also delegate a lot of the communication tasks, the things that they can't handle on here. And from a task process point of view, from a design point of view, it's close to identical. The motivations are incredibly different. Whether you have a choice or not is incredibly different, but from a design point of view, it's very similar. And I think I'm constantly surprised the extent to which people are able to delegate. And as a designer, to think about when we're designing processes, at what point can people delegate what to whom? So actually, illiterate people, I think, you talk to a lot of people about this, and I think they get the impression that this is going to be quite a boring, dry subject. You know, there's not going to be a lot of money in there, and so it doesn't interest people. But even if you take that point of view, which I totally don't agree with, but even if you take that point of view, actually illiterate people are just basically like us, but more so. They are lead users for people who want simplicity. And there's things like the kind of the extent to which they delegate tasks, as shown in the research that we've done, they're actually smarter. from a task design point of view. A couple of things to recap. So, everyone wants to be able to transcend time and space. And so, the question that we're asking as a company is, how can we support people in doing this? How can we support illiterate people to communicate personally and conveniently? Redesigning these is just a small part of the solution. There's actually a lot of other stuff that needs to happen, I think, as well. That's it. Thank you very much.
So we have a few minutes for questions. Yeah, you can press on your...
What did it look like?
Excuse me, what did who look like?
The telephone interface for illiterate people.
For illiterate people? Oh, I mean, it's a good question. And there's so much that I didn't cover in this presentation in terms of design solutions. And that's deliberate because, quite frankly, I could sell you a whole bunch of stuff, but I'd be shortchanging you, really. There are millions of people who are using mobile phones every day, and so that interface looks like what they're currently using, and that's the kind of that's the current situation. There are many little things that we're doing to improve the experience, but what we're really looking at is working together with operators and kind of other players in the kind of literacy ecosystem to actually redesign the whole kind of communication experience. So I can't show you, and I won't show you a single product. So.
What's your take on the approach that Motorola has taken with the Motophone? Is that the easy path that you were referring to in the beginning of the presentation? Without being too critic with Motorola, right? Obviously.
So Motorola has announced a phone called the Motophone, which is a very simplified device. I see Adam nodding there because I know he's very kind of keen on getting hold of one, I'm sure. So I was in India about a month ago, and I tried to buy one, and I wish I could give a fuller answer. So I'm basing it on what I've read rather than a use. So I think the approach that they've taken is actually excellent in terms of thinking about the issue. From the extensive research that we've done, I know that the solution is not easy. You just have to get the balance absolutely right. And I can't judge whether that product has got that balance right or not. I think it's the first product that's actively been marketed as appealing to illiterate people. But one of the issues that I have, potentially, is that will illiterate people buy something that's marketed to them? Right? The social stigma involved with being marketed to in that way.
I just find it fascinating that Motorola is marketed precisely as you say it is. It could not possibly be more correct. And if the iPhone were not to exist, I'm just saying that I find the existence of the phone completely fascinating, and that if the iPhone weren't to exist, the Motophone would be the only option for me. And how does that bifurcation happen? That it was explicitly designed and marketed with one set of audiences in mind, and winds up being all but irresistible to somebody at close to the far end of the spectrum.
Okay. Adam, have you ever used one? Okay. I have so many people coming to Japan and saying, Japan is so cool, you got all this lovely technology, but actually they don't use the technology, they see it. And the proof is in the use, with all due respect. So I do know that I think it can't handle international phone numbers on the display because there's not enough room. So that's one thing you might have an issue with.